patriarchal Middle Eastern context in which Judaism, Christianity, and Islam arose thousands of years ago continues to manifest itself in male-female relations today in this 21st century, oftentimes bordering on the absurd and ridiculous, and all too often carries with it discrimination, repression, and worse. Let me cite two specifically Jewish examples and leave it to your imaginations to cite others within our two sister religious traditions. And yes, I have used the phrase sister religious traditions consciously and by design. Example number one. There is no more iconic photograph than the first associated with the Holocaust, Shoah in Hebrew, which means devastation or destruction, than that of the woman and the boy, among others, being rounded up by the SS and Wehrmacht after the final German liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto in April-May of 1943. Though the woman has now been identified as Matilda Goldfinger, murdered sometime after the photograph was taken, her daughter Henka or Hannah moments after the photo was taken, the little boy has yet to be identified, though 5 claimants have attempted to do so. This photograph and all the horrors contained in the faces and eyes of the victims has spawned a book by Hebrew University professor Dan Porat entitled The Boy, A Holocaust Story, and a poem to the little Polish boy standing with his arms up by Hungarian Jewish Holocaust survivor Peter Fischl, and which contains the following lines. I would like to be an artist so I could make a painting of you, little Polish boy. I would like to be a composer so I could write a concerto of you, little Polish boy. I am sorry that it was you and not me. More relevant to our topic, however, is the fact that this past spring, in an issue of the Haredi ultra-Orthodox newspaper in Israel, Bakahilah, in the community, devoted to remembering the victims of the Holocaust, Matilda Goldfinger's face was blurred beyond recognition, with the unspoken rationale that seeing her face was somehow sexually stimulating and provocative to its male readership. According to the newspaper's editor, Avraham Dov Greenbaum, quote, we honor the memory of the victims of the Holocaust, and we also respect our readers and not only put in front of them what they need and want to see. Example number 2. The 19th century photograph shows men and women praying side by side at the Western Wall in Jerusalem without any mechitza, barrier or barricade whatsoever. I will skip the quote. I cite these examples as indicative not only of their disparity, but of the problems that even after 65 years of its existence, Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, is still evolving and still struggling to define itself as both Jewish and democratic, and not only with regard to its minority Palestinian population, and the role, place, and function of the religious traditions collectivized under the umbrella Judaism. Further, it must also be stated that at the time of its founding, its first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, and his cadre of secularist leadership were willing to grant the Orthodox community dominance over the laws of what is called in Hebrew, ishut, personal status, birth, conversion, marriage, and death, fully believing that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the surviving remnant of traditional European fundamentalist Jewish religiosity, which they themselves rejected, would eventually disappear. How wrong he and they were. Like one of our previous speakers, I'm going to skip 5 pages, which is a historical context on women in the biblical period and the post-biblical rabbinic and the early modern period. The next section is entitled December 1988, A Day of Change Unfolding Still. On December 1st, 1988, in conjunction with the First International Conference for the Empowerment of Jewish Women, held in Jerusalem under the auspices of the American Jewish Congress, 70 conference attendees went to the Western Wall, to the women's section, to pray aloud and read from the sacred Torah scroll on the occasion of the first day of the new month, which is called in Hebrew Rosh Chodesh, a ritual festival day historically and contemporarily associated with women. They represented all of the various religious streams of Judaism and included secularists, both Israeli and American, and some curiosity seekers as well. That initial worship service was disrupted by curses and threats by Orthodox men on the other side of the barrier, and some Orthodox women as well. Since then, without fail, every Rosh Chodesh, Israeli Jewish women, sometimes with other and larger groups, sometimes not, have gathered to celebrate their Judaism religiously. Despite verbal harassments, epithets such as reform, Gentiles, Nazis, or sluts, whores are not uncommon. Chairs thrown, rocks, and even bags of urine and garbage by those who regard any deviations from a narrow fundamentalist orthodoxy representative of a strident minority are an affront to God. By 1989, two groups had emerged. Wow, Women of the Wall, in Hebrew, Nashot HaKotel, and the ICWAL, the International Committee for Women of the Wall, a support network with fundraising capabilities. That same year, 1989, Women of the Wall turned to the Israeli court system for affirmation of its legal legitimacy in pursuing its prayer agenda, only to be teased with morsels. For example, the right to pray, but not aloud, and not with a scroll of the Bible, and rebuffed on other occasions. For example, delaying responding to petitions by asking for the establishment of governmental commissions, in the plural, over the years to study the issue and render resolution reports, a common stalling tactic in Israeli political circles, and then offering unacceptable solutions. And still the Women of the Wall have continued to pray, and by their praying presence continue to challenge the hegemony and authority of the Orthodox establishment in Israel. That is, until November 16, 2012, when Anat Hoffman, chairperson of the Women of the Wall and executive director of the Israeli Religious Action Center, affiliated with the Reform branch of Judaism in Israel and supported by its home base here in the United States, went to the Kotel to pray with 250 Jewish women from Hadassah, the largest Jewish women's organization in the world, was arrested, subject to police interrogation, strip searched, and forced to spend the night in jail. Hoffman, for 14 years a member of the Jerusalem municipal city government from the left, and a tireless and vocal advocate for women's and other minority rights, an outspoken opponent of Jerusalem's former mayor Ehud Olmert, who would later go on to become Prime Minister of Israel before being convicted of bribery and corruption, had found her moment. As she herself said in an interview, quote, "I have a unique ability to get pissed off," end quote. Since then, more than 125 articles have appeared not only in the Jewish press, but others as well. Following Hoffman's activity and those of Women of the Wall, many replete with photographs. Because of the unique ability of online media to have people respond to published articles and reports, many of them generate amazing numbers of comments, both seeing this as a struggle for women's equality, some even going so far as to see parallels with the struggle of equality for women in the United States as well as that of African Americans, and others condemning Hoffman as a self-centered, publicity-seeking, irreligious bitch, along with her colleagues, and part of a larger anti-Orthodox American agenda, and some even going so far as to suggest that she, the product of an American father and Israeli mother, is herself an enemy of Israel, and her activities and those of her sisters are giving aid and comfort to those, Hamas, Hezbollah, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, who want nothing more than the destruction of the state of Israel and the extermination, annihilation of Jews. Again, I will skip. So much has this become a public issue that the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has tasked Jewish Agency chairperson Natan Sharansky, former Soviet prisoner of conscience, human rights activist, author, and popular hero to many Jews worldwide, with coming up with a solution. The so-called Sharansky Plan, which seemingly initially applauded by all interested parties in Israel and the United States. It called for an expansion of the women's section near the Kotel and an even more accessible area known as Robinson's Arch, which, while historically part of the Kotel, has formerly been a site for many years for non-Orthodox religious gatherings and Torah readings. The plan would require a significant infusion of funds on the part of the Israeli government, to which Prime Minister Netanyahu was willing to commit, and would take several years to realize, noting in the meanwhile that not all would be happy or comfortable with the present situation, that legal challenges on the part of Nashot HaKotel would continue, and that the Haredi fundamentalist Orthodox community would have to give ground, both literally and figuratively, and be willing to compromise. As of this moment, the plan and its success and its implementation are in doubt. Some initial conclusions. As Mark S. Anshan, Board of Trustees member of the Union for Reform Judaism and past chairman of Artseinu, the International Federation of Reform and Progressive Zionists, wrote on May 14th in an online piece, A Tipping Point, Rosh Chodesh and Wow. The issue of prayer at the Western Wall is important on its own merits, but it also serves as a metaphor for the larger issue of religious pluralism in Israel, a Jewish society in which all forms of Jewish religious practice and custom should be recognized and respected. For liberal Jews, the very essence of what Israel should be as a Jewish state is what holds our own commitment and our connections to the land of Israel. I would also note that the issue of women praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem is also an expanded metaphor. For ultimately, which form of Jewish religious tradition will prevail in Israel, male-dominated authoritative orthodoxy, or male-female egalitarianism as manifested in the various non-orthodoxies, and or how Israel will continue to define itself in both the present and the future as both Jewish and democratic, and whether or not these two value-laden and value-oriented expressions of the human condition are incompatible or harmonious. Almost done, as quickly as I can. For this past 65 years, the largely secular state of Israel has allowed, with only momentary halts, when diasporic Jews have reacted negatively and loudly, including at times the very real threat of economic sanctions, Orthodox Judaism to have its way, preferring its secularism and the necessity of coalition politics with unrepresentative religious parties to hold sway. Increasingly, however, its lack of resolution in a country where its Declaration of Independence declares it a nation of respect and equality for all religious traditions and interpretations, but one where, having no constitution, it has allowed the court system to become the arbiters of its implementation in a haphazard and piecemeal way. To the degree to which Israel's safety and security and survival issues increasingly resolve themselves, the focus will continue to be the very character of the Jewish state and its Jewish people, and what the partnership with those living outside the land, primarily U.S. Jewry, will mean for its continued character and existence. The present imbroglio, as it manifests itself in this issue of women at the wall, simply cannot continue. If its Jewish people are to live together in their Jewish religious diversity, encouraged and supported politically, spiritually, and economically by those who will never make immigration or ultimately become its citizens. Furthermore, and finally, other related issues surrounding gender equality and religious pluralism go beyond the specifics. For example, one of the ongoing controversies ever since Israel's founding has been who decides whether or not one is or is not a Jew. Classical definitions are found in the Talmud are twofold: either the child of a Jewish mother and or one who undergoes the formal religious rite known as conversion. This is made even more conflictual in that each of the different streams of religious Judaism has its own standards and approaches, and not all agree with the other. Thus, to concede the standard of identity to the Orthodox only, as has been the case by and large since Israel's founding, continues to strain relationships not only within Israel, but in the United States and elsewhere as well. Impinging and intertwined with this issue is who gets to decide who is eligible to marry and divorce in Israel. And I have a section of the paper which addresses that issue of marriage and divorce. Solutions and resolutions. First off, The Sharansky plan, however, the likelihood or unlikelihood of its success on down the road is at best a so-called Band-Aid approach, and fails to address the underlying issues associated with and represented by women attempting to pray as equal religious partners in the free and democratic state of Israel, a state unfettered by an adherence to a narrow Jewish religious orthodoxy, which continues its ongoing attempts to impose its will on all its Jewish citizenry. The state's continuing reluctance to confront head-on the Orthodox religious establishment, whether under the guise or necessity of coalition-building party politics or the ruse of national security issues holding sway and dictating necessary present policies, will result in only more of the same. That is to say, increasingly and uglier confrontations between opposition groups who will redefine themselves in starker and even more strident ways, and thus lessening opportunities for compromise and by extension increasing divide between Israel's Jewish population and those Jewish communities outside the land of Israel, particularly in democratic nation states for whom women's issues and gender discrimination issues are likely to remain at the forefront of religious consciousness. Pessimistically, I want to skip a little more. Pessimistically, I do not see resolution of this issue anytime soon. If the present politically conservative regime of Prime Minister Netanyahu is at all indicative of Israel's political future internally and domestically, then fundamentalist Orthodox religious Judaism will continue to have too loud a voice and too much clout over a much larger Jewish population that increasingly, interestingly enough, at least according to some pollsters, is growing increasingly weary of these so-called internal religious wars and their potential to further divide the Jewish people in country. Then there is the question of the Palestinians, which we don't have time for. 2 paragraphs. One paragraph. A small or large beginning, depending on one's perspective, however, has recently been undertaken with regard to the military exceptions and exemptions of those full-time Orthodox male seminary and yeshiva students with the passage of a law which will call upon them to opt for either military or alternative service, which has already called forth protests both in Israel and the United States, and will necessitate an intensive modern educational endeavor on the part of the state to integrate them into the larger Israeli society as contributors to its economic and political well-being and future. Too many of those who have devoted their lives to such study are ill-prepared to enter the workforce, do not have the requisite skill set necessary to do so, and represent, as the result of a history of government handouts and subsidies, a sizable population far below the poverty line in Israel. All this may very well be on the cusp of change. The upshot of this small c confrontation may, by the law of unintended consequences, should the government of Israel ultimately prove successful, result in a lessening of the power of the chief's rabbinate. Israel has 2 chiefs rabbis, one Ashkenazic or Germanic, the other Sephardic or Spanish or Mediterranean, sons of previous ones recently re-elected and products of their own highly religious, conservative, and very narrow fundamentalist families, and the so-called lessening of power of the Orthodox establishment as well. Only time will tell. Thank you.